So as I said, friends, today we're considering things you can get wrong reading the Bible, and we're looking particularly at the idea of life after death. And I want to begin this morning by talking about Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas the Tank Engine featured large in our family. We've got a large, thick, heavy book which contains all of the stories in them, and they were a particular favourite of our son Alex when he was a young boy. The stories were written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, and then the story was taken up in actual fact by his son Christopher, and they were published from 1945 onwards. In the late 80s and the early 90s, a series on television was produced of animated versions of these stories. And I remember in the early 90s, there was something of a controversy that took place, because the producers of the television series began to write new stories for the Thomas characters that were part of the television show. And the author, or Christopher Awdry, objected at the time, and he objected not from the point of view that they were writing new stories, but that the stories they wrote were not possible. You see, Reverend Awdry, when he wrote his stories, and Christopher when he followed suit, they always wrote stories of things that either actually took place or actually could take place. They were all possible. And Britt Allcroft, the producer of the television series, began to introduce these more fanciful stories, things that were impossible, things that could never take place. And that shares a common theme with the parables of Jesus. Because Jesus' parables are always grounded in reality. He tells stories of agriculture, he tells stories of households, he tells stories from everyday life. He does not talk about fairies, he does not talk about magic spells, he does not talk about things talking that cannot talk. Now, there is a fanciful parable in the Bible, and that occurs in the book of Judges in chapter 9, the story where the trees get together and elect a king. But this is never true and cannot be said of Jesus' parables. So then, what do we make of the story of the rich man and Lazarus? You see, if we take the traditional view of life after death, that when we die, we are buried, we are no longer conscious, and we wait until the day of judgment to be resurrected, after which we may find ourselves in heaven or in hell. If that is true, this parable is the only parable of Jesus that is built on fantasy. As you know, I've been reading Heaven and Hell and recording, and I'm about halfway through, I think, now. And in paragraph 311, Swedenborg refers to the erroneous belief that there are angels and devils who were created as a separate race from humanity. And then the following paragraph, 312, he continues and he writes, "The man of the church also derives this belief from his believing that no man comes into heaven or into hell until the time of the last judgment. And about that he has accepted the opinion that all visible things will perish at that time and new things will come into existence, and that the soul will then return into its body, and from that union man will again live as a man. This belief involves the other, that angels were created such in the beginning. For it is impossible to believe that heaven and hell are from the human race when it is believed that no man can go there before the end of the world. In a sense, though, this is a secondary consideration. Irrespective of what you believe about life after death, whether it happens immediately when you die, whether it happens at this last judgment that is supposed to take place, the real question is how we find our eternal home. And irrespective of what you believe about the details of life after death, that is a question we must all answer, and we must answer it now. Elsewhere, Swedenborg writes, "A person must have heaven within him while in the world if he is to enter it after death." So what I'd like to do is make some observations from the text of this parable. Now, though he's unnamed, it is the rich man who is the main character. He is the focus of our attention in this parable. He's the actor in the story. Lazarus is somewhat more passive. And whilst we know that the rich man deserves his fate, we have no knowledge actually of whether Lazarus deserves his. Now, it's important for us to bear in mind as we read this parable, as it is with any Bible story, the context in which it is said, in which it is told. Chapter 16 dwells particularly on riches. We have also the parable of the unjust steward. If you remember, it's the man who is found to be corrupt in his dealings with his master's belongings, and he goes about writing down the bills of his master's debtors. So he's commended for acting shrewdly, although it's not necessarily very honest. And Jesus is really directing his challenge here to the Pharisees. He says in verse 14, so just before this parable, he calls them lovers of money. But I also want you to bear in mind that the previous chapter, chapter 15, contains three very well-known parables. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the prodigal son. So there's something more important at stake here than just money. Again, Jesus says, "You are those," and he's speaking to the Pharisees, "you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God." And then he goes on and he tells this parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So you can see here the connection between wealth and privilege and the sense of being saved, the sense of being honoured by God and having access to heaven where others perhaps don't. It reminds me in many ways of the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, which happens a couple of chapters further on in Luke chapter 18. Now, unsurprisingly, the Lazarus and the rich man switch places in the course of this parable. And it's actually emphasised, that switch is emphasised through the text in ways that we don't pick up in the English translation. So there's reference to falling in several places. So Lazarus is described as desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. And the rich man then desires that Lazarus provide relief for him in Hades. So there's this one desires something of the other in the earthly life, and then it switched. It switched in the heavenly world, in the spiritual world. But there's this idea of falling. That which falls from the table, and it may remind you also, the story of the healing of the daughter of the Syrophoenician woman, where she says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." So this idea of the crumbs falling from the table is an important one, and we find it reflected again in the idea of torment. So the rich man is found in Hades, and he talks about this torment that he is going through. And the torment, the root of the word means literally to go down. So it could be to go down into torment, or even to go down into sorrow. This is where this word comes from. So you can see there's a connection here between his former state in the natural world and the state he finds himself in the spiritual world. But then I also wanted to chase this word torment. Now, it was read in the New International Version by Jen this morning, and she mentioned on a couple of occasions the word agony. Well, in the New King James Version, it uses the word torment, and he uses it 3 times. But the thing is, in every case, every time this word torment is used, it's a different Greek word, which is quite interesting. So the first one, verse 24, "For I am tormented in this flame." This is the rich man. That's the one that means going down into sorrow, going down into torment. The second one is Abraham speaking to him, but now he is comforted and you are tormented. And this is suffering. That's, I guess, what we would more typically think of in terms of torment. And the latter one, lest they also come to this place of torment. Once again, the rich man is speaking, but he's referring to his brothers. Now, this word is particularly interesting because it probably is better represented with the word trial or test. It refers to a thing called the Lydian Stone, otherwise known as basonite, and the word in Greek is basonos. The Lydian stone, or black jasper, it's a variety of silicous or flinty slate of a greyish or bluish black colour. It is employed to test the purity of gold, the amount of alloy being indicated by the colour left on the stone when rubbed by the metal. So you can see the connection is very clear. There is a test here taking place. In the same way as gold rubbed on the Lydian stone is shown for its character, its true nature, by the mark that it leaves behind, there's the sense in which one's own inner nature is tested and shown to be for what it truly is in what is going on in this story. The rich man really here, when he says these words, he's asking for an exemption. He's asking for a get out of jail free card for his brothers, because he knows those brothers would fail such a test. And Abram refuses what would be a pointless exercise. You see, a visit from the dead does nothing to save a person. It provides a spectacular diversion in many ways, but unless there's a real commitment to change in the inner character and nature of a person's life, then the memory of the visitation from the dead fades, and so too does the commitment to change. We need to make a real commitment, one that is of the life, one that fundamentally shifts the way we go about our lives and the attitudes that we carry with us. And one way or another, we all face this test. Now, what do we know in actual fact about Lazarus? We have Abraham's words. Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and you are tormented. It's the same word Jesus uses in the Beatitudes. Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. He says, Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And it so happens it's the same word that Jesus uses to describe the Holy Spirit in John. In some of our translations, it's actually translated as paraclete, which is very close to the Greek original word. It's translated in some as helper or comforter. The image, I think, is one of having a good lawyer on your side in a court of law. That is the comfort that you are receiving, comfort in the test. You see, Lazarus has been through the test too, but his comfort is spiritual, not natural. The comfort is that the divine truth has not been rejected in his life. One of the things I've long thought about our society, and sometimes even about the church, is that we are far too quick to seek justice. We're far too quick to seek retribution, reparation, when we see ourselves or sense or believe ourselves to having been wronged by someone else. We live in a highly litigious culture. If you trip over a crack in the pavement, or if your child falls off some play equipment at the park, all too often we have this call, whether it's in our own mind or we're reminded by other people, we have this call to sue. Get the compensation that is owing to you. But I ask you, friends, what's the end result of that? It's a pretty poor place, I think. It doesn't make it any better, really, for any of us in the long run. And as I revisit or I rethink about the Beatitudes, and particularly as you see them related in the Gospel of Luke, you see, in Luke's Gospel we see them set one against the other in terms of one is a blessing and one is a woe. It's a very interesting presentation of the Beatitudes. As we read those, we realise that, well, woe betide us if we have not suffered in this world at the hands of others. You know, blessed are you when they persecute you, is how it's put in Matthew's Gospel. So life, and life as a Christian, life as someone who seeks to follow the Lord, is not about seeking justice for ourselves. It's just not what the Lord calls us to at all. The only people who benefit from our obsession with justice is lawyers. So my question for you for this week, one I'm not going to answer this morning, I'll let you do that for yourself, is considering the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. If life is not about seeking justice, if life is not about seeking comfort, then what is it about? I want to finish with by sharing a reading with you, and I'll put the words up on the screen. I've already referred to part of Secrets of Heaven, paragraph 9832, and I'm going to read a section more of it now. The truth, which belongs to faith, leads the way to good, and afterwards is brought forth from it, that is, from good. A person is not in heaven until good is present within him. If merely the knowledge of truths, called the truths of faith, is present in a person, he does no more than stand in front of the door. Or, if knowing those truths, he is looking towards good, he goes through into the porch. But if, in knowing those truths, he is not looking towards good, he cannot see heaven, not even from a long way off. The reason for saying that a person is not in heaven until good is present within him is that a person must have heaven within him while in the world if he is to enter it after death. For heaven exists within people, and it is granted in mercy to those who, during their life in the world, allow themselves to be led by means of the truths of faith into charity towards the neighbour, and into love to the Lord, that is, into good. People are not in heaven until they have come into that state in which the Lord leads them by means of good. By good is meant the good of life, and the good of life consists in the performance of what is good because there is a will for what is good. And a will for what is good springs from love. For what a person loves, he wills.